The discovery of the Gilgo Four was only the initial chapter of the horror. As the investigation expanded, the remains of 6 other individuals were found in the vicinity of Ocean Parkway, creating a complex, challenging constellation of victims known as the other victims or the LISK perimeter cases. These discoveries immediately complicated the initial, clear-cut profile of LISK, forcing investigators to confront the possibility of multiple killers or a single predator with a far more diverse and brutal modus operandi. The first and most perplexing of these additional finds were the partial remains discovered in the same area as the Gilgo Four. These remains, later identified as belonging to 2 women and a child, had connections to older, unresolved cases, suggesting a far longer timeline for the predator's activities or the presence of a different killer. These victims included Jessica Taylor, whose partial remains have been discovered in Manorville, Long Island, in 2003, suggesting the killer had been operating for nearly a decade before the Gilgo Four were found. The additional remains found near Gilgo were later confirmed to belong to her, establishing a definite, chilling link across time and location. Jane Doe number 3, who remained unidentified for years, whose partial remains were linked to another torso found on Fire Island in 1996. This connection implied a terrifying possibility that the killer's reign of terror could stretch back nearly 15 years. Baby Doe, the remains of a young child, found alongside one of the adult female remains. Forensic evidence later confirmed that this child was the daughter of one of the adult victims found nearby, further cementing a pattern of extreme brutality and complexity. The discovery of these partial and dismembered remains immediately raised profound questions that defied the initial, neat profile. Why were these bodies dismembered, while the Gilgo Four were found intact? Why were the remains of a child and victims whose bodies were spread across vast distances included in the same area? The LISK task force was forced to consider 2 main theories: multiple killers, suggesting that the Gilgo Four were the victims of one organized predator, while the partial and older remains were the work of another, separate killer operating in the same dumping ground, or a single, evolving killer who changed his modus operandi over time, perhaps starting with dismemberment and later switching to the organized, intact concealment scene with the Gilgo Four. Furthermore, 2 more victims, known as Jane Doe number 6 and Peaches, whose remains were also linked to older, partial discoveries, added layers of complexity. These unresolved cases of the LISK perimeter broadened the investigation scope to include a wider range of victimology and an expanded geographical area, increasing the difficulty of the manhunt tenfold. The true scope of the Long Island serial killer's terror, therefore, extends far beyond the 4 most famous victims, encompassing a chilling possibility that one or more killers utilized the desolate Long Island coast as a permanent, secret dumping ground for decades. The discovery that launched the Long Island serial killer investigation centered on 4 specific victims, tragically linked by their method of disposal and their close proximity along Ocean Parkway, earning them the indelible name, the Gilgo Four. Their initial finding in December 2010 provided the first concrete evidence of a serial killer and set the grim parameters for the massive, decade-long manhunt that followed. The discovery was sequential, beginning with the remains of Melissa Barthelemy. Melissa, a 24-year-old woman from Buffalo, New York, working as an escort, had been missing since July 2009. Her remains were found on December 11, 2010, marking the first confirmed victim. Crucially, before the discovery of her body, Melissa's family had received taunting, anonymous phone calls from a male voice using her cell phone, suggesting the killer had a direct, psychological connection to his victims even after their deaths. The investigation intensified immediately, leading to the discovery of 3 more bodies in the immediate vicinity within the following 3 days. Next was Maureen Brainerd Barnes. Maureen, a 25-year-old mother of 2 from Norwich, Connecticut, was working as an escort and had gone missing after traveling to Manhattan in July 2007. Her disappearance had been a cold case for over 3 years. Her remains, like Melissa's, were found carefully concealed in the dense underbrush, confirming a pattern of meticulous disposal. The third set of remains belonged to Megan Waterman. Megan, a 22-year-old mother from Maine, was also working as an escort when she disappeared after traveling to Hauppauge, Long Island. In June 2010, she was last seen leaving a hotel in a vehicle. The close proximity of her body to the others further cemented the chilling conclusion that one predator was responsible for these deaths. The final member of the Gilgo Four discovered in that initial phase was Amber Costello. Amber, a 27-year-old from North Carolina who was struggling with drug addiction, was working as an escort when she disappeared from West Babylon in September 2010. Investigators believe that Amber may have been actively trying to flee her situation before she vanished. The discovery of the Gilgo Four established the killer's modus operandi and victim profile: young women, predominantly working in the sex trade, who were likely contacted online and then disappeared after meeting with a client. The victims were found wrapped in burlap, placed close together in a discreet area accessible only by someone familiar with the terrain. The initial shock of finding four bodies in quick succession transformed the investigation from a search for a missing person into a full-scale manhunt for a highly organized, dangerous serial killer who had been operating undetected for years, raising immediate questions about how such a brazen series of murders could go unnoticed for so long. Following the intense media coverage and initial search phase that uncovered the 10 sets of remains, the Long Island serial killer investigation entered a frustrating, protracted period characterized by a decade of silence. From roughly 2011 to 2021, the case seemed to hit a wall, becoming one of the most notorious cold cases in the country, plagued by internal politics, funding issues, and a stark lack of new leads from the killer himself. The initial flurry of evidence, the phone calls, the burlap, the victim profile, proved to be insufficient for a definitive breakthrough. The technology of the time was unable to fully process the limited DNA evidence recovered from the scene, and the cell phone data, while pointing to a local area, was not precise enough to identify a single suspect. The killer, seemingly aware of the intense focus, ceased his taunting phone calls and went completely silent, a strategic move that allowed him to retreat into the anonymity of a suburban life. The investigation was further complicated by political and jurisdictional disputes. The various victims were found in areas overseen by different police agencies, leading to early confusion and a perceived lack of centralized leadership. This led to persistent public criticism that the police response was fragmented and less focused than it should have been for a case of this magnitude. As the years passed, the intense media scrutiny faded, and the case transitioned into a cold case status. While the dedicated detectives continued to work the files, the investigative energy dwindled. The lack of a major new discovery or a mistake by the killer meant the case relied almost entirely on the hope of a forensic breakthrough, a new technology that could process the limited, degraded evidence left behind at the crime scenes. During this decade, the families of the victims continued their relentless advocacy, keeping the LISK case in the public eye and criticizing the slow pace of the investigation. They refused to let their loved ones be forgotten, becoming the primary force pushing for renewed resources and commitment from law enforcement. The decade of silence was a period of immense psychological stress for the investigators and the victims' families. It was an agonizing demonstration of the serial killer's calculated brilliance, the ability to execute a series of brutal crimes and then completely disappear into the vast, anonymous landscape of the suburbs, leaving behind only the question of whether he had stopped killing or simply become an even more meticulous predator. This long period of stagnation highlighted the limitations of conventional detective work against a highly organized foe and ultimately paved the way for the necessity of next-generation forensic science to finally break the wall of silence. The history of Long Island, New York, is typically defined by its sprawling suburban communities, its wealthy enclaves, and its picturesque, wind-swept coastline. But for over a decade, a dark, chilling shadow was cast over its serene landscape, transforming the isolated stretch of beach and marshland near Gilgo Beach and Oak Beach into a sprawling, clandestine graveyard. This is the story of the Long Island serial killer, or LISK, a predator who operated in the shadows, whose crimes stretched over a terrifying, decade-long period of uncertainty, and whose true identity remained a complete mystery until a quiet suburban architect was finally arrested. The discovery of the first bodies in late 2010 did not begin as a homicide investigation, but as a desperate missing person search. The initial focus was on Shannan Gilbert, a young woman who had vanished in May of that year after a chaotic night near Oak Beach. It was during this search, conducted by a police officer in his K-9 unit near Ocean Parkway, that the shocking truth began to emerge. The officer's dog, trained to locate human remains, discovered not Shannan Gilbert, but the remains of Melissa Barthelemy, concealed in the dense thicket off the isolated road. This initial finding quickly metastasized into a far greater horror. Over the following days and weeks, the search continued, revealing a total of 10 sets of human remains, all found within a remarkably short, desolate stretch of coastline. 4 of these women, who became known as the Gilgo Four, were found just feet apart, meticulously positioned and concealed, instantly confirming the terrible realization that a serial killer was operating with impunity on Long Island. This discovery launched one of the most prolonged, complex, and politically charged serial killer investigations in American history, an investigation defined by early missteps, frustrating stagnation, and a relentless, decade-long digital pursuit of a phantom. The killer's signature was immediate and terrifying. The victims were all young women, primarily working as escorts, who had vanished after connecting with clients online. The method of disposal, wrapping the victims in burlap and meticulously concealing them in the dense brush, indicated a methodical, organized predator who knew the area intimately and who possessed a terrifying confidence in his ability to evade law enforcement. This confidence was well-founded. For years, the killer remained elusive, taunting police with anonymous phone calls and leaving investigators with little more than skeletal remains, a handful of digital breadcrumbs, and a pervasive, decade-long fear that settled over the entire region. The story of LISK is a narrative of tenacity and tragedy, a testament to the victims whose lives were brutally cut short and the dedicated, often criticized, investigators who refused to let the case go cold. It is a story that ultimately proves that even the most meticulous planning can be undone by the persistent march of forensic science and the simple, everyday digital trail left by a man who believed he was untouchable. One of the most chilling and psychologically significant pieces of early evidence in the LISK investigation were the phone calls, a series of taunts and digital clues that provided a direct, terrifying insight into the killer's narcissistic personality and his method of operation. These calls, made from the cell phone of the first confirmed victim, Melissa Barthelemy, serve as the primary, direct communication between the killer and the outside world. Shortly after Melissa Barthelemy's disappearance in July 2009, her younger sister began receiving a series of anonymous, harassing phone calls from Melissa's cell phone. The caller was a male who often taunted the sister, using crude language and making cryptic statements about Melissa's whereabouts. The caller's voice was described as a male, calm, and deliberate. Crucially, the killer used these calls not to demand ransom or confess, but to psychologically torment the victim's family, fulfilling a core narcissistic need to exert control and witness the impact of his actions. This element of taunting immediately reinforced the psychological profile of LISK as a highly controlled, confident, and manipulative predator. The calls provided immediate, crucial digital clues. By tracing the cell tower pings, investigators were able to establish a geographical perimeter for the killer's movements during the calls. The calls were brief, often lasting only a minute, and were made from various locations in the vicinity of Massapequa and other towns along the south shore of Long Island. This geographical footprint, established through early cell phone forensics, firmly placed the killer within the suburban heart of Long Island, validating the initial hypothesis that the suspect was a local resident, intimately familiar with the area. However, the technology of the time, 2009, was a major impediment. While the police could map the general area of the calls, they could not pinpoint a single location or definitively identify the caller's identity from the voice recording. Furthermore, the killer soon realized the investigative value of his digital taunts. After the initial discovery of the bodies in late 2010, The phone calls cease entirely, another calculated move by the predator to eliminate the most direct link between himself and the investigation. The phone calls, therefore, became a powerful piece of static evidence. They provided a crucial early geographical anchor for the investigation and painted a terrifying psychological portrait of a killer who enjoyed the process of control and psychological torment. The analysis of these original taunts and the preservation of the limited digital data from the cell tower pings became vital years later when the investigation was revitalized with advanced digital forensics, proving that the killer's narcissism was ultimately the most significant mistake he made. In the immediate aftermath of discovering the Gilgo Four, law enforcement and the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit immediately set to work constructing a profile of the unseen suspect, the predator who came to be known as the Long Island serial killer, LISK. This early profile was crucial, forming the psychological and demographic framework that guided the entire subsequent investigation, though it would evolve significantly over the decade. The initial profile established LISK as an organized, methodical predator. The careful concealment of the bodies, the use of burlap in the close, deliberate clustering of the remains indicated a killer who was not operating in a frenzy, but executing a specific, ritualized disposal plan. This suggested a high degree of intelligence, planning, and knowledge of forensic avoidance. He was someone who understood crime scenes and how to eliminate evidence, often a trait seen in individuals with professional training or a high degree of confidence. Demographically, the profile suggested a white male, likely in his 20s or 40s, who was a resident of Long Island and was intimately familiar with the remote, desolate areas near Ocean Parkway. The killer would have needed consistent, quiet access to a vehicle capable of transporting bodies and an intimate, local knowledge of the area's secluded brush where the victims were found. Psychologically, the profile emphasized a killer driven by a need for control and dominance. The fact that the victims were all women involved in the sex trade suggested a sexual motivation rooted in the ability to dehumanize and control women perceived as marginalized. The taunting phone calls made from Melissa Barthelomew's phone, where the killer called her family, strongly indicated a narcissistic component, a need to engage with the consequences of his actions and assert his psychological superiority over law enforcement and the victims' families. A key element of the early profile was the killer's presumed ability to blend into society. LISK was likely perceived as normal by his neighbors and colleagues, perhaps even married or in a stable relationship. Serial killers rarely stand out. Their greatest camouflage is normalcy, the ability to maintain a meticulous double life, one dedicated professional routine and the other to horrific violence, was a hallmark of the profile. This suggested a man who held a steady job, likely one that provided him with the flexibility or rationale to move bodies unnoticed, perhaps involving construction, long work hours, or off-hours activities. However, the profile was complicated by the discovery of other remains that did not fit the initial demographic, namely, the remains of children and other adult women, some dismembered, found further along the parkway. This led to internal debate. Were there multiple killers, or was LISK experimenting with different victimology and methods? The initial profile focused squarely on the killer of the Gilgo Four, a methodical predator using the internet to target and dominate women he could easily lure. This early psychological sketch, combined with a few pieces of digital evidence, became the initial roadmap for the decade-long pursuit of the unseen suspect. After the decade of silence, the LISK investigation finally experienced the first breakthrough, a critical pivot point driven not by new witness testimony, but by the re-examination of cold case DNA evidence using new, advanced forensic technology. The key piece of evidence was a single, innocuous object found at one of the original crime scenes. The initial investigative team had preserved a small number of crucial pieces of physical evidence, including DNA from a male suspect found on the burlap used to wrap some of the Gilgo Four victims. However, the quantity and quality of this DNA, combined with the limitations of early 2010s technology, meant that the profile could not be matched to any known individuals in the national database. The first major breakthrough occurred when a new task force, formed in the early 2020s, decided to re-examine and reprocess the limited DNA evidence using modern, highly sensitive extraction and amplification techniques. This new analysis yielded a more robust male DNA profile. Simultaneously, the team focused on another piece of evidence that had been painstakingly preserved from one of the crime scenes, a single male hair strand found on the remains of Megan Waterman. This single hair, which was subjected to mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, analysis, provided a crucial, direct link to the killer's maternal lineage. The most critical step was the establishment of a direct link between the DNA found on the burlap and the hair found on the victim's body. The DNA profile from the hair was not sufficient for a direct match, but provided a strong genetic signature. The male DNA from the burlap, which could now be processed more thoroughly, became the target profile. This re-examination achieved two things. It confirmed that the DNA profile was unique and not contaminated, and provided a profile robust enough to be entered into a new, controversial type of database, forensic genetic genealogy, FGG databases. FGG technology, which compares unknown DNA profiles from crime scenes against consumer genetic databases, with consent of the database owners and through legal means, proved to be the key that unlocked the cold case. This technology allowed investigators to bypass the National Criminal Database and instead search for the killer's distant relatives. The meticulous work of re-examining the original evidence, the burlap DNA and the hair strand, was the crucial first step. It validated the decade of preservation efforts by the original detectives and laid the groundwork for the final, technologically advanced phase of the investigation that would ultimately lead to the suspect arrest. The hair strand, once a minor piece of evidence, became the silent, definitive witness that finally broke the Long Island serial killer's long reign of silence. While the Long Island serial killer investigation is indelibly linked to the Gilgo Four, the true missing link that initially started the search and later became a source of significant controversy was the case of Shannan Gilbert. Her disappearance in May 2010, 7 months before the discovery of the Gilgo Four, ultimately led investigators to the other victims. But her own remains were not found until over a year later, in a location far removed from the others, creating a fierce debate over whether LISK was responsible for her death. Shannan Gilbert, a 24-year-old woman working as an escort, traveled from New Jersey to meet a client at a residence in Oak Beach, a secluded, private community near Ocean Parkway. The night of her disappearance was characterized by extreme chaos and erratic behavior. After the meeting with the client, Shannan suddenly fled the house in a panic, running through the streets and desperately knocking on the doors of neighbors, pleading for help and claiming someone was trying to kill her. This frantic, bizarre behavior, witnessed by multiple residents, was consistent with a person experiencing a severe psychological episode or extreme fear. Police responded to the scene that night, but Shannan was gone before they could locate her. The search for Shannan in the remote, marshy area eventually led to the shocking discovery of the Gilgo Four in December 2010. Despite this connection, investigators initially maintained that Shannan's death was separate from the LISK murders, classifying it as a non-homicidal incident, possibly an accidental death or drowning related to her frantic escape through the marsh. The official reason for separating her case was the eventual discovery of her remains in December 2011. Shannan's skeleton was found deep within the marsh, approximately 3 miles from where the Gilgo Four were located. Furthermore, her body was not concealed or wrapped in burlap like the other victims, suggesting a different method of disposal, possibly consistent with her having succumbed to the elements or drowning after becoming disoriented in the marsh. However, the family of Shannan Gilbert and their legal team vehemently rejected the official ruling, arguing that her death was directly linked to the LISK case. They pointed out that her disappearance was a catalyst for finding the other victims, and that the strange circumstances of her frantic flight, where she claimed someone was pursuing her, strongly suggested foul play, perhaps by the same predator. The controversy over Shannan Gilbert's case became a major political and public hurdle for the investigation. It raised questions about the thoroughness of the initial police response and whether the desire to simplify the LISK case led investigators to prematurely dismiss a key victim. The lingering doubt over Shannan Gilbert remains a crucial, complex part of the LISK narrative, serving as the essential missing link that initiated the discovery, but whose true cause of death may hold the final, unresolved answers to the full scope of the serial killer's terror. The LISK investigation had stalled for nearly a decade, but the advent of new forensic technology and a shift in political commitment led to the new task force, a decisive revitalization of the cold case that brought renewed resources, cutting-edge science, and a centralized focus to the complex investigation. This new, determined approach was the final factor necessary to hunt down the unseen predator. The catalyst for the formation of the new task force in 2022 was a combination of persistent public advocacy by the victims' families, the release of key investigative documents, and the arrival of new leadership within the Suffolk County Police Department. The newly established task force was characterized by its centralized command structure, bringing together investigators from the Suffolk County Police Department, the New York State Police, and the FBI. This organizational change was critical, eliminating the interagency friction that had hampered the early stages of the investigation. The primary mission of the new task force was to digitize and reanalyze every piece of evidence from the decade-old case files. This included revisiting the original cell phone tower data, cross-referencing all known LISK movements with new Geographical Information Systems (GIS), and most critically, focusing their entire effort on the Forensic Genetic Genealogy (FGG) initiative. The task force dedicated significant resources to working with specialized forensic genealogists. Using the male DNA profile refined from the re-examined burlap, the genealogist meticulously constructed the killer's family tree, identifying distant cousins and narrowing the search down to a specific branch of the family that resided on Long Island. This work was a painstaking process of elimination, requiring the task force to investigate dozens of potential individuals who matched the initial profile parameters. Furthermore, the task force put renewed emphasis on re-interviewing key witnesses and focusing on the digital footprint of the victim's final contacts. They cross-referenced every known suspect generated by the FGG search against the cell phone records from the original Taunting calls, seeking a physical and digital convergence. The revitalization of the cold case marked a pivotal shift from relying on traditional detective work to embracing the power of modern science and interagency cooperation. The new task force was not chasing shadows. They were meticulously following a biological and digital thread that spanned over 10 years. The dedication of this new team, armed with FGG and advanced digital mapping tools, was the final, inevitable force that would shatter the killer's long-maintained anonymity and lead directly to the identification of Rex Heuermann. The ultimate breakthrough in the Long Island serial killer case was achieved through forensic genetic genealogy, FGG, a revolutionary modern science that cracked the cold case after a decade of stagnation. FGG is the investigative tool that finally bridged the gap between the limited DNA profile left on the burlap and the actual identity of the unseen suspect, Rex Heuermann. FGG is a technique that takes an unknown DNA profile from a crime scene and uploads it to publicly available voluntary consumer genetic databases, like GeneMatch, with legal consent, searching not for a direct match, but for distant genetic relatives. When a match to a second or third cousin is found, forensic genealogists then work backward, painstakingly constructing the entire family tree of the unknown donor, using public records, birth certificates, and obituaries. This process allows them to triangulate the relationship and narrow the suspect pool down to a small number of males within the relevant age and geographical bracket. In the LISK case, the robust male DNA profile recovered from the burlap wrapping of the Gilgo Four victims was uploaded to these FGG databases. The search successfully identified several distant maternal and paternal relatives of the killer who had submitted their own DNA for genealogical research. The genealogists assigned to the new task force meticulously mapped the family tree, eventually leading them to a small cluster of brothers and cousins who fit the initial geographical profile, Long Island, and age profile, mid-50s to mid-60s. The successful identification of a specific family line was a crucial leap. It provided the first real, tangible names after 10 years of chasing abstract profiles. The investigation was then narrowed down to one primary suspect, Rex Heuermann. The final step in the FGG process, once a primary suspect was identified, was to obtain a direct, confirming DNA sample from that individual. This was achieved through meticulous surveillance. Investigators discreetly collected abandoned DNA from Heuermann, a discarded napkin, a coffee cup, or most famously, a pizza crust left in a trash can. This sample was then directly compared to the DNA found on the burlap. The resulting match was overwhelmingly positive, providing the definitive scientific evidence needed to secure the warrant for his arrest. Forensic genetic genealogy proved to be the ultimate undoing of the LISK's decade of calculated silence. It rendered the killer's meticulous efforts at avoiding detection obsolete, demonstrating the relentless power of modern genetic technology to solve even the most challenging and long-standing cold cases, finally turning the attention of the investigation from an abstract profile to the tangible reality of Rex Heuermann. Following the significant breakthrough provided by forensic genetic genealogy (FGG), the abstract, two-decade-old profile of the Long Island serial killer suddenly materialized into a specific, tangible individual, Rex Heuermann, a seemingly ordinary suburban architect from Massapequa Park. This sudden narrowing of the focus required the new task force to engage in an intense period of traditional surveillance and digital investigation to confirm that this quiet professional matched the monstrous characteristics of the unseen predator. The initial FGG results pointed the investigation toward the Heuermann family line, and the ensuing genealogical work quickly identified Rex Heuermann as the primary suspect. He fit the key parameters established over a decade ago. He was a white male of the correct age bracket and, crucially, he was a longtime resident of Massapequa Park, a town directly within the cell tower radius of the Taunting phone calls made from Melissa Barthelomy's cell phone in 2009. The neighborhood, close to the original dumping ground along Ocean Parkway, provided him with intimate geographical knowledge and easy, discreet access to the desolate area. The task force immediately established intensive, round-the-clock physical surveillance on Heuermann. They observed his mundane daily routines, his commute to his architectural firm, RH Consultants and Associates, located in Midtown Manhattan, his interactions with his family, and his seemingly quiet life in the small, modest home he had inherited from his parents. This contrast between the professional architect, specializing in code compliance, and the suspected serial killer operated with extreme violence was a defining psychological feature that investigators had to reconcile. A critical piece of evidence that further narrowed the profile and tied Heuermann to the original crime scenes was his vehicle. Investigators revisited the scant physical evidence from the early 2010s, which included a witness description of a dark, first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche pickup truck seen in the vicinity of the Gilgo Beach area around the time of the disappearances. Through license plate records and surveillance, the task force confirmed that Rex Heuermann had owned and driven a vehicle matching this exact description during the period the Gilgo Four went missing. This convergence of evidence, the genetic lineage, the geographical location matching the phone pings, the professional facade, and the ownership of the key witness vehicle, was too compelling to be coincidence. The profile of the unseen killer was no longer an abstract psychological sketch. It solidified around the figure of the suburban architect and his dark truck. The final, necessary steps involved a meticulous collection of confirming DNA and the complete mapping of his hidden digital life, ensuring that the evidence against the man who had avoided detection for a decade was utterly undeniable. The decade of silence maintained by the Long Island serial killer was fundamentally shattered by the intense, modern phase of the investigation focusing on digital surveillance. The new task force recognized that while the killer may have stopped making direct phone calls, his compulsion to engage with his dark fantasies and victims would inevitably leave an extensive online footprint. This digital trail became the final, crucial component of the evidence linking Rex Heuermann to the LISK crimes. Investigators executed a meticulous, in-depth analysis of Rex Heuermann's online activity, recognizing that an organized serial killer often engages in extensive digital preparation, research, and fantasy fulfillment. The initial surveillance quickly revealed a pattern of behavior that shockingly aligned with the crimes. Heuermann was found to have created and used numerous burner phones and anonymous email accounts for communication. The cell phone data from these burner phones was cross-referenced with the original cell tower pings from the Taunting calls in 2009, revealing a direct and stunning geographical overlap during the time of the murders. The digital footprint extended into the darkest corners of the internet. Investigators discovered that Heuermann had conducted thousands of online searches related to his victims and the LISK investigation itself. These searches were not random. They included specific inquiries about the Gilgo Four, using the victims' names and checking for news updates on the case. Searches for images and videos related to sexualized violence, torture, and child pornography. Research on various methods of dismemberment and disposal, indicating a macabre, clinical interest in the mechanics of homicide. Searches for specific locations near the dumping grounds along Ocean Parkway, suggesting he was either planning new sites or revisiting old ones. The digital surveillance further revealed Heuermann's intense connection to the sex trade. He had used his burner phones and anonymous emails to frequently contact sex workers online, scheduling appointments and engaging in communications with individuals matching the LISK victim profile. This demonstrated that his predatory behavior was not limited to the past, but was an ongoing, active part of his double life. The combination of the geographic data from the burner phones matching the 2009 taunts, the explicit and specific nature of his online searches related to the victims, and his active digital engagement with the sex trade provided the task force with the necessary evidence to confirm the FGG match. The digital surveillance phase proved that even the most careful and organized killer cannot escape the persistent, indelible trail left by modern technology. Rex Heuermann's digital footprint was not just circumstantial evidence. It was a terrifying, voluntary confession, mapping his obsession, his planning, and his intimate connection to victims and the 10-year-old investigation. The final, critical step in transforming Rex Heuermann from a primary suspect into the accused Long Island serial killer was the DNA match, achieved through a calculated act of surveillance that secured the abandoned pizza crust and the confirmation of his biological identity. This piece of forensic evidence provided the scientific certainty needed to secure the warrants for his arrest and the search of his home. Once Rex Heuermann was identified as the prime suspect through forensic genetic genealogy, FGG search, and the subsequent digital surveillance, the task force needed one final, unassailable piece of evidence: a direct, current, and confirming DNA sample that could be directly compared to the male DNA found on the burlap wrapping of the Gilgo Four victims. To achieve this without alerting the suspect, the investigation entered a phase of highly meticulous covert surveillance. Detectives monitored Heuermann's movements, waiting for an opportunity to collect an abandoned DNA sample, a piece of garbage, a cigarette butt, or any object he had discarded containing his epithelial cells or saliva. The breakthrough came when investigators were able to retrieve an object that Heuermann had discarded in a trash can outside his Manhattan architectural office: a partially consumed pizza crust. The pizza crust was immediately sent to the New York State Crime Lab. The forensic team carefully extracted the DNA profile from the saliva left on the crust and compared it directly to the male DNA profile that had been meticulously preserved and reanalyzed from a burlap found with the Gilgo victims. The result was definitive and absolute. The DNA profile from the abandoned pizza crust matched the DNA found on the burlap with overwhelming statistical certainty. This moment of confirmation was the culmination of over a decade of forensic work. It proved, beyond any reasonable scientific doubt, that the man living a double life as a quiet architect was the same individual who had physically handled and wrapped the bodies of the Gilgo Four victims before dumping them along Ocean Parkway. The DNA match was a legal and scientific game-changer. It satisfied the probable cause standard needed to obtain a warrant to search Heuermann's home, his vehicle, and his office, opening the door for the collection of further, definitive evidence that had been concealed for years. The abandoned pizza crust, a mundane item of daily life, became the ultimate undoing of the Long Island serial killer, demonstrating that in the age of advanced forensics, the smallest, most careless act to provide the decisive link that shatters a decade of calculated secrecy. The man arrested and accused of being the Long Island serial killer, Rex Heuermann, presented a psychological paradox. A successful professional who maintained a life of quiet suburban normalcy while allegedly harboring a secret, decade-long existence of extreme violence and depravity. The secret life of Rex Heuermann is a terrifying study in contrasts, defined by the stark dissonance between his professional status, his family life, and his overwhelming obsession with the most marginalized in society. Heuermann maintained a public image as a code-compliance architect who owned his own successful firm in Midtown Manhattan. He dealt with complex zoning laws and building safety requirements, suggesting a methodical, highly organized mind. The very traits the LISK profile had always emphasized. He was known to dress well, commute daily, and speak to the press about his work, projecting an image of stable, middle-class competence. At home in Massapequa Park, he lived in the childhood house he inherited, next door to his brother, and was married to his wife, Asa Ellerup, with whom he had 2 children. For over 2 decades, his family and neighbors believed he was simply a strange but harmless eccentric, a quiet fixture of community. Yet, investigators revealed a pervasive world of isolation and obsession lurking beneath this facade. Heuermann's digital footprint showed an intense, compulsive preoccupation with the LISK case, the victims, and the darkest forms of sexualized violence. He had maintained burner phones and anonymous accounts specifically for contacting sex workers, indicating a predatory drive that transcended his family commitments. The psychological profile suggests that his secret life was the central feature of his existence. The meticulous nature of his architecture work may have provided the necessary cover and the intellectual framework for his methodical violence. The isolation of his double life was likely fueled by the narcissistic pleasure of operating undetected, the feeling of intellectual superiority over both law enforcement and his victims. His marriage and professional success were merely a cloak of normalcy, a necessary component of his camouflage that allowed him to move freely between his 2 worlds. The stark revelation of his secret life has forced his family and community to grapple with an agonizing truth. The quiet neighbor, the professional architect, and the family man may have been a methodical monster operating right under their noses for decades. The case of Rex Heuermann serves as a powerful, unsettling reminder that a terrifying, meticulously hidden existence can flourish even within the most mundane and quiet corners of the American suburb. The capture of Rex Heuermann, the suburban architect accused of being the Long Island serial killer, occurred in a sudden, quiet moment that belied the 10 years of terror and the global impact it would have. The arrest of the quiet architect sent a global shockwave, finally resolving one of the most persistent and notorious cold cases in modern American history. Following the definitive DNA match from the pizza crust and the comprehensive convergence of the cell phone data, digital surveillance, and vehicle evidence, the task force moved to execute the arrest. The timing and location were chosen carefully to ensure public safety and minimize the risk of the suspect destroying further evidence. On the evening of July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was taken into custody while leaving his architectural office in Midtown Manhattan. The arrest was executed discreetly by the Joint Task Force, bringing a swift and quiet end to his dual life. The immediate aftermath of the arrest was one of profound global shock. News of a suspect in the LISK case, a man who was not a known drifter or ex-convict, but a respectable, successful architect and family man, immediately dominated international headlines. The revelation confirmed the deepest fears of the public. The killer was not an outsider, but a highly functional member of society who had operated with brazen impunity for decades. For the victims' families, the arrest was a moment of agonizing relief and vindication. After years of fighting for resources, facing public indifference, and enduring the slow grind of cold case, the capture provided the first tangible promise of justice. Their relentless advocacy had finally paid off, proving that the lives of the marginalized victims mattered. The most immediate investigative phase following the arrest was the execution of search warrants on Heuermann's home in Massapequa Park, his office in Manhattan, and a storage unit. The scene at his home, a small, unassuming dwelling next to his brother's house, was transformed into a full-scale forensic site. Investigators spent weeks meticulously processing the house and property, searching for trophies, forensic evidence, and any physical connection to the victims. The global shockwave extended beyond the legal sphere. It resonated across the suburban landscape, forcing communities to re-examine their own neighbors and the unsettling idea that extreme evil could be masked by the most mundane of routines. The arrest of Rex Heuermann did not close the case, but it marked the definitive end of the hunt for the Long Island serial killer, ushering in the complex phase of prosecution and the long process of unraveling the full, devastating scope of his alleged crimes. The execution of the search warrants on Rex Heuermann's Massapequa Park home and his Manhattan office immediately transformed the investigation into a physical recovery mission, culminating in the opening of the evidence room, a trove of potential evidence and alleged hidden trophies that provided a grim, tangible window into the killer's private world of obsession. The search of Heuermann's small, dilapidated family home was a meticulous process that lasted for weeks. The house, crowded with belongings and described as having a strong, unpleasant odor, was treated as a primary crime scene. Investigators searched every inch, often digging up the yard and basement, hoping to find human remains, a possibility heightened by the discovery of a soundproof room in the basement. The initial reports confirmed the discovery of a significant volume of evidence directly linking Heuermann to his alleged crimes and his dark fantasies. This evidence included a vast collection of more than 200 firearms, a fact that underscored the killer's fixation on power and control. More disturbingly, investigators recovered evidence of digital obsession. This included numerous computers, electronic devices, and hard drives containing a staggering volume of sexually explicit and violent material, including images and videos related to torture and serial killer documentation. The sheer volume of this hidden digital life confirmed the extreme depth of his morbid compulsion. A key focus was a search for trophies, physical items taken from the victims as mementos of the kills. While the full list of recovered evidence remains under protective order, reports confirmed the seizure of various items, including belts, duct tape, and other restraints, which may have been used in the commission of the crimes and retained by the killer. The existence of a soundproof room in the basement, as reported by investigators, provided a chilling suggestion of a dedicated space for his violent activities, a literal hidden vault within the suburban home, where he could act out his most terrifying fantasies with impunity. The contents of the evidence room served a dual purpose. First, they provided the prosecution with the necessary physical evidence to connect Heuermann to the original LISK victims, building a case based not just on DNA and phone data, but on the presence of physical materials related to the murders. Second, they offered a terrifying psychological portrait of the accused, a man whose outward life was a mask for an overwhelming, meticulously organized inner world of violence, obsession, and the systematic collection of dark mementos. The opening of the evidence room provided the definitive confirmation that the man arrested was indeed the predator who had terrorized Long Island for decades. The relentless focus on the killer, the DNA, and the investigative process often obscures the profound, irreversible human cost of the Long Island serial killer's alleged actions. The victim's remembered chapter serves as a crucial ethical anchor, shifting the focus beyond the case file to honor the lives and the dignity of the women who were brutally taken, individuals whose complexities and humanity were often ignored by both the killer and, at times, the media. The Gilgo Four, Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello were not merely case numbers or subject to a police profile. They were daughters, sisters, and mothers. Melissa Barthelemy was described by her family as a vibrant, generous spirit who was struggling to make a new life for herself. The pain inflicted upon her sister through the killer's taunting phone calls became an infamous part of the case, but her memory is best defined by the love and devotion of her family, who fought tirelessly for justice. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was a dedicated mother of 2 young girls, whose decision to travel to New York was motivated by a desperate need to provide for her family. Her disappearance left a devastating void in her children's lives, and her sister became a central, relentless advocate for all the victims. Megan Waterman was a young mother from Maine, attempting to overcome personal struggles. Her remains were found with the DNA that ultimately led to the killer's identification, making her a silent, crucial witness in the final act of the case. Amber Costello was known for her sense of humor and warmth, despite her battles with addiction. Her memory is preserved through the fierce dedication of her friends who mourned her sudden, tragic vanishing. The victims who were not part of the Gilgo Four, including Jessica Taylor, the unnamed Jane Does, and Shannan Gilbert, also represent an immense, lasting human cost. Their memories ensure the investigation recognizes the full scope of the tragedy, stretching back nearly 2 decades. The importance of the victims remembered is an ethical one. It challenges the media narrative that often simplifies the victims' lives into a single, often judgmental description. Sex worker, thereby dehumanizing them and minimizing the brutality of their fate. The victims were vulnerable, marginalized, and their lives were tragically cut short by a predator who exploited their precarious status. Their enduring legacy is the sheer force of their families' determination to seek justice, a dedication that persisted through the long decade of silence and finally brought the case to its shocking conclusion. The focus on the individual lives of these women ensures that the final narrative of the LISK case remains one of profound loss and a pursuit of accountability for the marginalized. With the arrest of Rex Heuermann, the focus of the Long Island serial killer investigation shifted entirely to the prosecution's case, the complex legal strategy to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in a case that relies heavily on digital forensics, genetic genealogy, and circumstantial evidence from over a decade ago. The prosecution, led by the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, faces the immense challenge of consolidating decades of scattered evidence into a single, compelling narrative of premeditated murder. The core of the prosecution strategy rests on the scientific convergence of evidence. They must demonstrate how the pieces of digital and biological evidence, individually compelling but collectively overwhelming, all point directly to Rex Heuermann. The central elements of their legal argument include the DNA match. The undeniable forensic link between the male DNA on the burlap and the DNA sample collected from the abandoned pizza crust is the cornerstone of the case. The cell phone data. The geographical overlap between the burner phones used by Heuermann and the cell tower pings from the Taunting calls made from Melissa Barthelomew's phone, placing him specifically in the vicinity of the crimes. The digital footprint. The thousands of online searches conducted by Heuermann, inquiring about the victims, the LISK case, and various violent and explicit content, which demonstrate motive, premeditation, and obsession. The prosecution must also address the physical impossibilities and logistical challenges that initially shrouded the case. They will argue that Heuermann, as a methodical architect and a local resident, possessed the unique knowledge, resources, and calculated intelligence necessary to execute the crimes, conceal the bodies, and evade detection for years. The evidence recovered from his home, including potential trophies and the soundproof room, will be presented to establish his long-term planning and the systematic nature of his alleged violence. The defense, conversely, is expected to employ a strategy centered on challenging the novelty and reliability of the forensic techniques, particularly forensic genetic genealogy, arguing that it is an inadmissible or unreliable form of evidence. They will also likely argue that the DNA found on the burlap is merely a transfer of evidence and that Heuermann, as an architect who frequently worked in the area, may have had a non-criminal reason for his presence in the geographical area. The legal battle in the prosecution's case will be a landmark moment in forensic law. It will test the admissibility of FGEG in a major serial killer trial and determine whether the convergence of digital and biological evidence, meticulously collected over a decade, is sufficient to prove guilt for crimes that occurred years before the technology to solve them even existed. The strategy is clear: to paint a picture of a calculated, double-life predator whose arrogance led him to leave a trail of evidence that ultimately proved to be his undoing. The capture and indictment of Rex Heuermann in connection with the Gilgo Four has partially solved the LISK enigma, but the full, terrifying scope of the killings remains an unresolved question that continues to challenge investigators and haunt the public. The LISK case is complicated by the presence of at least 6 other sets of human remains found in the same vicinity, demanding a thorough attempt to unravel the full scope of the killings and determine if Heuermann is responsible for all 10 victims. The central question is a connection to the other victims. Heuermann has been formally charged with the murders of the Gilgo Four, Barthélemy, Brainerd Barnes, Waterman, and Costello, as the primary DNA evidence directly linked him to them. However, the remains of the 6 other individuals, including the dismembered bodies of Jessica Taylor and Jane Doe No. 3, and the death of Shannan Gilbert, remain formally uncharged in the indictment against him. Investigators are actively working to establish a definitive link between Heuermann and these additional victims. The potential exists for 2 scenarios. Scenario 1, Heuermann is responsible for all 10 or more victims. This would suggest that he is a more prolific and diverse killer than initially profiled, starting with the dismemberment of earlier victims like Jessica Taylor and Jane Doe No. 3, and then refining his modus operandi to the non-dismemberment and organized disposal of the Gilgo Four. Scenario 2, there was more than one killer using the desolate stretch of Ocean Parkway as a dumping ground. This is a terrifying, equally plausible scenario that complicates the narrative, suggesting that the initial task force may have been hunting multiple, distinct predators operating in the same area. The investigation is currently focused on the digital evidence recovered from Heuermann's vast collection of electronic devices, hoping to find further connections, images, communications, or geographic data that directly link him to the other 6 victims. Furthermore, the case of Shannan Gilbert remains a crucial, separate piece of the enigma. While officially ruled an accidental death, the possibility that Heuermann was a client she fled from that chaotic night in 2010, or that he was involved in her death, is still a major focus of continued investigation. The LISK enigma will not be fully resolved until investigators can definitively account for fate of all 10+ victims found along the Long Island coastline. The unraveling of the full scope of the killings is an ongoing process that will determine the final count of Rex Heuermann's alleged victims and may finally confirm whether he was one killer operating in the shadows or merely one of several predators who preyed upon the vulnerable. The story of the Long Island serial killer, LISK, reaches its necessary but challenging conclusion with the arrest of Rex Heuermann, a moment of justice delayed that took over a decade and required the unprecedented application of modern forensic science to achieve. The full legacy of this case, however, extends far beyond the courtroom, serving as a profound indictment of systemic failures and a persistent call for accountability and victim advocacy. The delayed justice in the LISK case highlights the initial failures of the investigation, the fragmentation of resources, the political interference, and the tragic indifference to the lives of the marginalized victims who were predominantly working as sex workers. The decade of silence was not a failure of evidence, but a failure of prioritization, a reality that allowed a highly organized predator to operate with brazen impunity. The ultimate success of the case is a testament to the perseverance of the victims' families who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. Their voices, often amplified by advocates, ensure the case remained open until technology finally provided the answer. This is the most crucial lesson of the LISK investigation. The inherent worth of every human life, regardless of social status, must be the foundation of all police work. We urge all law enforcement agencies to immediately adopt and fully fund advanced forensic genetic genealogy units to systematically clear the backlog of cold cases involving serial violence. We demand immediate and sustained funding for victim advocacy groups that serve vulnerable and marginalized populations, ensuring that all victims are treated with dignity and that their disappearances are aggressively investigated from the moment they are reported. Finally, we must foster societal commitment to accountability, ensuring that the systemic failures that allowed a predator to operate for decades are permanently rectified. The arrest of Rex Heuermann is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the long road toward true justice, which requires remembering the humanity of the victims and ensuring their tragedy leads to lasting systemic change.